Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of Cosmos Foundation, let me welcome you to this very important event and timely dialogue on the relevance of United Nations for Bangladesh, a prognosis for partnership. I'm Nabila Rahman, and I would like to personally thank each of you for taking the time to attend this very important gathering, especially our distinguished speakers and panelists. It has been very important for Cosmos Foundation to organize a dialogue series as we continue to grow and adapt. Some of you will have attended previous installments on various issues, ranging from relations between Bangladesh and the European Union, Bangladesh and UK, Bangladesh and India, Bangladesh and China, to the Rohingya crisis, to Baul music and philosophy. Cosmos Foundation is always open to new ideas that can help transform society and lead to a better future. And your support along this journey is extremely important to us. So without further delay, let me thank each of you again for enriching the occasion with your presence. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the chairman of the Cosmos Foundation, Mr. Inayatullah Khan, to deliver the opening remarks. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning. And a very warm welcome to today's event under the banner of Cosmos Dialogue. Understanding through debate is our slogan at Cosmos Dialogue, sponsored by Cosmos Foundation. I can see by this participation of this large audience today, as in the past, that there is an increasing interest among our audience to come and attend these kind of events. Cosmos Foundation is the philanthropic arm of the Cosmos Group. We are trying relentlessly to stimulate the thought and deliberation on the most important topics relevant to our community, our nation, the region, and indeed the world. Each of our events to date, with your support and encouragement, has been a great success. Our media has ensured that our thoughts and voices are spread far and wide. Our seminars and symposiums are matched by publications that have earned plaudits for their quality. It's our wish, indeed our goal, that as Bangladesh continues to march forward, the Cosmos Foundation would aspire to provide the intellectual infrastructure to support this phenomenon. For that is far more sustainable foundation to a nation's growth than what bricks and mortar and steel can ever construct. A mark of our recognition is our collaboration with ISAS, the Institute of South Asian Studies under the National University of Singapore, which is considered as Asia's one of the most prominent and foremost citadel of learning. It is reflected in the fact that most of our events have been chaired by Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry, our former Foreign Affairs Advisor and currently the Principal Research Fellow at ISAS, a most eminent scholar diplomat in this region. Recently, I was a participant at an important seminar at ISAS in Singapore entitled Bangladesh and UN Peacekeeping, which produced some excellent ideas in the form of takeaways. It is our intention to take these conclusions forward by our focus on the topic at Cosmos as well. This is not just to underscore what Bangladesh does for the UN, but also how a major element of the UN Charter in terms of global peace and stability can be suitably delivered. Indeed, our topic today fits this theme. It is on Bangladesh and United Nations, a prognosis for partnership. The next session of the UN General Assembly is scheduled to commence in the last week of the current month. There will be a powerful delegation representing Bangladesh, which will carry to that august house the developmental and other advances made in Bangladesh under the able stewardship of the Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. Also, Bangladesh can and does assist the UN in its bid to secure charter goals and aspirations in its manifold activities. It is our hope that our deliberations here may be viewed as a curtain raiser to our participation in that all-important occasion in New York later this month. I shall risk the accusation of a modicum of modesty by the claim I'm just about to make. It is that very fact that we have such an illustrious global personality to deliver our keynote address is already a measure of our great success. He is someone with an unmatched reputation as a national and international leader and a speaker, Lord George Mark Malloch Brown. He has had an enormously successful career in the United Kingdom, his home, and also abroad. Lord Mark Malloch Brown has been a political journalist at The Economist, a vice president at the World Bank, administrator at the United Nations Development Programme, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and then at home, a minister at the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Following this very distinguished career, he was created a life peer in 2007. Currently, he still continues to be an active in the British Labour Party. It is our hope that in course of his address on the topic of the day, he would also share with us some of his insights on the developments currently unfolding in the United Kingdom, in which I'm absolutely certain our audience is deeply interested. It is also my pleasure and indeed honor to extend a heartfelt welcome in our midst, Mr. M.A. Mannan, Member of Parliament, Honorable Minister for Planning. This is particularly so because this is the first time we are having the privilege of his presence and participation at such a Cosmos event. However, most certainly, it will not be the last time, and we look forward to his continued support to our activities. He has an illustrious record of public service, both as an official and therefore as a public person, thereafter as a public person, having had a long and successful career as a Member of Parliament and Minister. With these words, without further ado, I would now request our Chair, Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry, to proceed with conducting our event. Thank you.
Honorable Planning Minister, Mr. M.A. Mannan, my very good friend and dear colleague with whom I have spent several absolutely delightful years filled with incredible memories. Might I add that I would like to congratulate you on your new responsibilities, in which you have already shown signs that you'll bring credit and you'll make all your friends proud. Thank you for being here with us. Lord Mark Malloch Brown, our distinguished speaker, who has been introduced, and I'll have a few words to say about him later down the line. Our Foreign Secretary, Mr. Shahidul Haq, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, friends of Cosmos. It's a pleasure, as always, to be back in Dhaka among friends, and also to a Cosmos event hosted by Chairman Inayatullah Khan. His indomitable energy and manifold interests are already talk of the town. From my perch in ISAS, in Singapore, I've been viewing with admiration his relentless efforts in creating that intellectual architecture, infrastructure that in Bangladesh that you have just spoken of. Such a building, even if it's something of the mind, is a bit like a Gothic cathedral. It's never quite finished, but each little component will provide joy, pleasure, and also a sense of accomplishment, as this event also does. Inayat has given an excellent introduction to Lord Mark Malloch Brown, and under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have much to add. But there is nothing normal about Mark. And so I feel I should be derelict of my responsibilities were I not to share some recollections from my personal observation of him at work. George Mark Malloch Brown, KCMG of Leonard's Forest in the county of West Sussex. His name is not hyphenated, but his title is. He's obviously a man of prodigious proportions. Don't look at his figure, but intellectually. His brilliant mind was shaped at Magdalen College, Cambridge, initially, and sharpened and honed in the School of Life's experience. He has been most things under the sun. A journalist and later tending to refugees during a flamboyant youth, a senior world banker in maturer years, the head of the most important global development agency, the UNDP, and then at the UN headquarters itself. As Kofi Annan's chef de cabinet, I've seen him labor 24/7, tirelessly at getting UN budgets approved. Never an easy task. And then as Secretary General, shepherd the Millennium Development Goals, fired and fueled by the spirit acquired as he progressed through his career. Back home, an appointed Privy Councillor and Minister, he earned the wrath of the neocons from across the pond, from across the Atlantic, that is, who called him Saint Mark for his liberal views and also for his principled opposition to the Iraq War. Today, he chairs Best for Britain, a cross-party group, a campaign which believes simply that what is best for Britain is to stay in the European Union. Despite the obvious need for him to be in London as the Brexit crisis unfolds, his presence here shows the best in him, which is really championing the cause of development, of which his love for Bangladesh is a part. So thank you, Mark, for choosing to be with us. While we will doubtless discuss Brexit as we go along, as you have heard, we also want to take advantage of his presence to dwell a while on the United Nations and how Bangladesh need relate to it. The United Nations is a reservoir of humankind's highest ideals. The historian Paul Kennedy has called it the Parliament of Man, an idea he attributed to a rambling work of the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson called Locksley Hill. It is critical for weaker state players like Bangladesh included, to have an international club rules that ask for a global order. The UN tries to do just that. There are many things that Bangladesh sees in the United Nations. Number one, as a protector of sovereignty and provider of security. Number two, as a forum to air views on global issues of importance to us. Number three, as a single platform to relate bilaterally to 192 other countries and saving us costs because it does not require us to open missions and embassies in each of these countries. And fourth, as a source of development support through initiatives such as the MDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, as a setter of universal norms, values, and standards, including on subjects such as health and disease, food security, and climate change. Bangladesh cannot support it with financial resources. Hence, we make ourselves relevant through participation in such activities as peacekeeping and peace building. Today, the post-war global liberal order is under threat, as is multilateralism and the institutions connected with it, including the United Nations. A world without the United Nations, even if it isn't the Parliament of Man as once envisioned, is better and safer than a world without it. Dag Hammarskjöld believed that the UN exists not to lead the world into heaven, but to save it from hell. But that is not the reason enough for us not to endeavor to make it better and more relevant. Higher goals for more good calls for greater striving. As the mighty Rabindranath Tagore had simply yet profoundly observed, inspiration follows aspiration. I thank you.
Well, good morning, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Thank you very much, Mr. Khan, for the hospitality and sponsoring all of this, to my friend Ifti Chowdhury for chairing it and inviting me, to the Minister for his attendance here today and gracious remarks, to old friends and colleagues in the room, the High Commissioner, who is a colleague in the British Foreign Office, and Mia Zeppo, the UN Resident Coordinator, who is a colleague of mine in UNDP. So it's nice to be here with friends. Perhaps just two obvious points. I am an ex-UN Deputy Secretary General, so when I speak of the UN, I speak of what I know of it rather than for it. And that is perhaps an important distinction, given some of the sensitive subjects I expect we will touch on before the morning is through. And secondly, on Brexit, I'm more than happy to talk about Brexit, but I think I'm going to leave these first opening remarks to the subject of the UN, and then in the questions we can come back to Brexit, because Brexit has a strange habit of colonizing and taking over everything else. And so the poor UN would be the wallflower left behind if I got started on Brexit. So let me at least start with the United Nations. And I pondered the subject of this seminar with considerable thought and interest, and really conclude that for a country like Bangladesh, there is a, if you like, comprehensiveness, a totality to its UN relations. And I want to talk about those through four perspectives: Bangladesh in the world, Bangladesh in its neighborhood, Bangladesh's development, and Bangladesh's extraordinary role in UN peacekeeping. And let me start with Bangladesh and the world. If Bangladesh was anywhere else in the world, it would count as a very large country indeed. Its misfortune is to be a 6-footer in a region of 7-footers, which means that it's never quite going to triumph on the sports field in the same way as some others. And having as neighbors China and India, having other very large countries in the region, Pakistan, Indonesia, others, in a sense has for the world not allowed Bangladesh to be seen for what it is, a country of 165 million people, a country rapidly growing economically, a country shortly to graduate from its LDC status. But in a sense, bigger than the perception issue is the fact that it leaves Bangladesh as one of those medium-sized powers which needs the United Nations as the global guarantor of a system of global free trade, a system of the rule of law, a system where large powers don't just impose their will on smaller ones by virtue of the strength of their military and other might. And so, let me just dwell for a moment on that, if you like, Bangladesh in the world, a country whose growth, which I've already said was remarkable, has depended heavily on an export-oriented model, exporting textiles and other goods to the world. 17% of your GDP now comes from that export sector. But like other Asian tigers that have gone before you, it has required that liberal global trading regime for you to benefit. It's required access to those overseas markets in a low tariff manner, a system which is at the core not just of the post-Second World War order, but at the core of the values system and law-based system that the UN is seen as champion of. But it's not just in something like trade that sort of global rules-based system is so important. Take another equally prevalent issue today of climate. I, as UNDP administrator, knew Bangladesh up close through the issue of annual flooding, and I saw a country which year by year just got smarter and better at its mitigation strategies for managing those floods. But of course, they are not diminishing, and you know, and the management of them is highly dependent on neighbors as well. Those rivers that flood into Bangladesh down through the basin, you know, are rivers sourced out of India and China, where those countries' approach to deforestation, to dams, to both the use of water and the husbanding of water and the management of water have a critical impact on flooding and climate and environment here in Bangladesh. And so again, it is to the UN that we look for the global management of climate change, a fair burden sharing in a way that doesn't leave smaller, more vulnerable countries behind. And then if you look at the geopolitics, another perhaps the most critical of all dimension, where a UN system of collective security intended to protect the weaker from the stronger and to protect countries from you know, unreasonable demands on them by neighbors. You know, for many years, the most active sort of peacekeeping and security challenges for the UN were in the Middle East and in Africa. But I think we are seeing Asia emerging as a new front line of geopolitical contest. The overarching changing relationship is that between the US and China, as a steady rebalancing of that relationship in favor of China takes place. But you are also living in the shadow of a growing contest between India and China. And if you take more broadly the status of this region, by far the world's largest, you see a process of rapid economic change and urbanization, which is creating new classes of winners and losers across all the countries of the Asian region. And with it, creating new causes of conflict, exacerbated by many of those environmental issues I've already mentioned, with resource constraints of water being greater in this region than in most, with changes in diet leading to new pressures on food supply. And it is in that more choppy, turbulent region and world that a strong United Nations to keep the peace and manage conflict between countries and, when necessary, within countries, is so critical, in my view, to the interests of a country like Bangladesh. Now let me second turn to the neighborhood. And no country chooses its neighborhood, although the circumstances of Bangladesh's birth as a nation, you know, very much was a reflection of the difficulties of this neighborhood of yours. Nobody chose that you would have, on the one side, India with increasingly difficult relationships with some of its minorities, of which the issue of Assam is now, you know, bursting into view for all of us. But secondly, the tragedy of the Rohingya from Myanmar. Bangladesh has got one of the greatest population densities of any country in the region, and yet it finds itself the home to refugee populations. And this is a great test of the values of a country, its ability to deal with this in a wise and just and human way. And you look at the issue of the Rohingya and see the difficulties of repatriation programs when the government in Myanmar is felt to have still not acknowledged the original sources of the exodus, let alone redress them to a point where it would encourage return. And one can understand the frustration amongst Bangladesh citizens at this unanticipated burden on your economy. And you know, I know the great strains and stresses on services and the caused. And I, who began my my professional life working for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and served intensively in Asia and initially in Thailand, where there was a similar unanticipated influx from Cambodia across the border into Thailand, saw these same, if you like, sort of episodes play themselves out of initially warm humanitarian reception of refugees, followed by increasing frustrations and difficulties at the local community level, which in turn fed into national politics as the government began to realize that this was a burden of some duration and length. Although now, like so many refugee problems, one solved, with no refugees left, all having returned or gone on to resettlement in other countries. So I suppose message one is these problems can for a time look quite overwhelming, but their solutions do finally become arrived at. But the second message is it is not for any European to lecture Bangladesh on its responsibilities or issue of conscience around refugees. Europe has betrayed its own standards on this in a dramatic way in recent years, and still has paid a very high political cost. The politics of Germany, Italy, arguably the whole of Europe, have been turned on their head in part by the initial generous reception of refugees by Germany, and then subsequently Europe throwing up barricades against refugee entry from Syria and northern Africa. So what I say to you about displaying generosity in your treatment of refugees is not based, if you like, on sort of European morality of any kind at all. It's based on the appeal to the interests of a country that wants to be a well-regarded leading member of the international community, a voice and force at the United Nations. And the set of relationships which allow you to be such in the UN are relations of give and take. On some areas like the environment and climate, you look to your neighbors to help you by modifying their own behaviors. On others, you find yourself needing to lead the global response and demonstrate the values of the Charter and of international refugee law. Let me turn to my third area, development. And again, praise a country that when Ifti and I first knew each other when he was ambassador in Geneva, the country's graduation from its LDC status looked much longer in the future than has been the case, and this has reflected the dramatic economic success of recent years here. But what it does mean is a transition in terms of your international development assistance relationships, already underway as the World Bank has already upgraded your classification, but with the UN system as well, post 2024. And it also, just losing that status is one step on the path of development, and in fact, leaves you with really major issues for which I hope the international community can be an ally, a provider of advice, of technical assistance, and of still significant loans and grants. And the issues I would just quickly tick off are issues of inequality here, that Oxfam, I think, reports that you have the highest number of dollar billionaires in the region, but you are still a country where the environment, for example, in addition to the flooding issue I spoke of early, earlier is eating away at your coastal communities with salination and rising sea levels, leading to a massive displacement of people coming in to cities like Dakar because their livelihoods in the rural coastal areas are no longer viable. And that, of course, contributes to increasing income inequality. So your development journey is, in that sense, by no means finished. The need for a development strategy that generates good jobs and opportunities for a growing youth bulge is critical, as is the need for the investment in education to allow that youth to go with Bangladesh in its journey, up the economic order, so to speak, to more complex models of manufacturing and service provision in the future. And another issue of development which is critical, and I say this as someone who is head of UNDP, has seen pretty much every model of development there is out there. Critical to any successful sustainable model is sufficient room for civil society. And again, this is one of Bangladesh's global points of leadership. No other country has generated a pair of organizations like BRAC and Grameen. These have been models for service provision, for microfinance, for innovation in the delivery of civil society development programs the world over. And increasingly one sees BRAC now operating in many other countries around the world, Afghanistan, countries in Africa, etc. And so there is a great role of civil society in Bangladesh, but it's a need to make sure that that includes the adequate space for political debate and political debate about development priorities. It means ensuring that social problems which are not at all unique to Bangladesh, you only have to see the demonstrations in South Africa over the last week against violence against women to know that this is an issue across pretty much the whole of the developing world, and Americans and Europeans would argue in different forms very much an issue in those countries as well. So issues of this kind need to be attended to and thought about in a serious development model as you move forward. Let me just say that I know there is now work on the 8th five-year plan. There is the newly constituted UN cooperation. It used to be called something else. It's now called a UNSCDF. But perhaps above all else, there is the global solidarity of which Bangladesh is so much part around the SDGs. Ifti mentioned my role in the MDGs, their predecessors, but what these have created is global goals which allow us to feel part of a global development effort where we are beginning to have the comparative data to see how different countries are prioritizing between education and healthcare and job creation. But also we have a global conversation about the comprehensiveness of development, that you need to do so many different things and attend to so many different priorities to build the right kind of society for the future. And so Bangladesh, with its economic success, with its extraordinary ambassadors, civil society ambassadors of BRAC and Grameen and others, is a major voice in that debate and should be heard in New York and elsewhere for that. And then let me just turn finally to the fourth area I mentioned at the beginning of Bangladesh and peacekeeping. You've been in the top 5 peace contributors in countries for the last decade or so. You, I think, still have around 8,000 peacekeepers out there, and you've had 83,000 Bangladeshis serve across 45 missions during the life of UN peacekeeping. And I think I don't need to rehearse to you the advantages that has brought, the soft power advantage, the advantage of your military working shoulder to shoulder with colleagues from India and Pakistan, and the relationship building that creates with consequences for your own regional relations back home. The impact on training and equipment that this allows for Bangladesh, where I know you now have the Bangladesh Institute of Peace Support training, and of course a significant financial benefit of some $300 million annually in both wages to the troops, but also overheads to the military. And you do this at a time where the complex model of calculating contributions to UN peacekeeping, which combines per capita income along with overall GDP numbers, means that some of the very, very, very smallest UN countries, San Marino, for example, with a population of 33,000, contributes more financially to peacekeeping than Bangladesh does. But as I say, you make up for that as an extraordinarily generous troop contributor, and that has always been the model, that those who can contribute financially do, those who are willing to offer troops and other support provide that critical in-kind contribution to effective peacekeeping. And peacekeeping, though, and I think I do have to warn you this, is as I suspect everybody in this room is aware, is something going under a lot of transition. First, you've had the Trump administration demanding less of it, so that the budgetary cost to the US is reduced. We've seen both operations in Haiti and West Africa closed. We see some rugged holders on like Mali and the Congo in Africa. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was in the Congo this week, and pledged again to the new leadership there, President Tshisekedi, to keep up the momentum of UN peacekeeping in the Congo. But I think the writing is on the wall. There are very unlikely to be new large missions of the kind that we have seen in the past in Middle East and Africa. And this, is for a number of reasons. The sort of thin blue line concept of keeping the peace between countries had already been overtaken by reapplying that thin blue line to inside countries like the Congo or Mali to try and keep warring parties from each other's throats. And increasingly it's seen that UN peacekeeping rarely has, the nimbleness or air power to operate effectively in some of these difficult new contexts. And so UN peacekeeping is very much, I think, under review, with a sense that past missions have been too ambitious for the budgets allowed them, and that there's got to be a cutting of the cloth to more realistic ambitions. And that, above all else, we're going to see a much greater focus on mediation rather than peacekeeping. The Secretary General has reorganized his two departments of political affairs and peacekeeping to try and semi-combine them in order to prioritize mediation before you arrive at peacekeeping. And where there is peacekeeping, I think we're going to see, either regional organizations taking the lead, like as happening in, for example, Somalia, with just the sort of back office and logistics functions being provided by the United Nations. And that does raise the question of, if there are such peacekeeping operations in the future in Asia, what is the equivalent of the African Union? Because this is a region which has not developed strong regional institutions in the same way that Africa has been lucky enough to do. And we're likely to see more specialist missions. So, people think it very unlikely that Syria or Yemen or Ukraine, to take the three big conflicts of current times, would ever have large UN peacekeeping missions. But what you saw, for example, in Syria was, a very successful UN OPCW, which is the Chemical Weapons Convention, joint mission to monitor the use of chemical weapons. In Yemen, you see a small UN team monitoring the so-called Stockholm Agreement. So I think there will be more smaller, lighter, specialist missions, but that obviously has consequence for the model of peacekeeping that Bangladesh has until now supported. I think the big question, and it will be a highly and has always been a highly controversial question at the UN, is whether or not there will be greater counter-terrorism capacity built at the UN to deal with groups who are just outside the political pale of organized global political life. And you know, there is a lot of anxiety politically around this, a fear that, you know, the UN might, as it did in Iraq, be appeared to somehow be aligned with the United States in a way that led to our headquarters being bombed there in 2003, but where, you know, in truth, the UN had resisted that conflict mightily, but to terrorists, those distinctions often get lost. So, you know, would a UN that was willing to take on counter-terrorism operations become a more militarized UN, unable to carry out its development missions and losing the confidence of a minority perhaps, but often key states who might not accept the premise that particular groups were terrorists. So, you know, there's a lot in the peacekeeping field to be reviewed. I think perhaps one last observation is that there's been a recent report on Cruz report on the security of UN peacekeepers, which has made a lot of sensible recommendations about how to better protect them, to have a better duty of care towards peacekeepers deployed in the field. And that's good news for Bangladesh, whose soldiers have fallen in the line of duty in Congo and Bosnia and elsewhere. So that is, you know, a key improvement that I hope will come. So what I've described is a Bangladesh which has a whole set of relationships with the UN around global issues, regional issues, around development issues, around peacekeeping. And the proposition I want to make to you all is that you can't separate one out and drop your responsibilities on one and expect somehow to sustain your influence and standing on the others. This is a chair with four legs. Don't take one of the legs away. So difficult though the burden is on the Rohingya, and difficult though the burden is of your location with, as I say, Assam and other problems ahead, I think a critical bit of Bangladesh's soft power, of its global leadership, comes from handling these problems with patience and humanity, whatever the difficult political challenges it generates at home. And so let me just say, because I do want to echo what the Minister said, you know, this is not at the moment the best of times for the United Nations. I think he's quite right that various of its agencies could do with a serious reboot and refreshing in terms of the effectiveness of their offering to, you know, a country like Bangladesh. But much more profoundly, the UN has always been a, you know, victim of interstate politics going on around it. It is never free of them. A great Secretary General can get a step ahead, but then the tide turns on him, and having worked arguably for the greatest Secretary General of the UN's time, Kofi Annan, I know that very well. He was always using the phrase in his soft, gentle voice that you cannot change the wind, but you can bend the sail. And his point was that the leadership of the UN has always been the art of the possible. The Minister referred to it with Hammarskjöld's even more famous phrase about the UN is not taking you to heaven, but it's saving you from hell. And we are in a period, let's face it, of dramatically difficult international relations. We have a rising bilateralism and nationalism across many countries in the world, and particularly across some of the world's largest countries. China, India, United States, Brazil, I can name them. We have this rebalancing of power between the US and China, for which the current front line is Asia itself. We have a Europe in crisis, of which Brexit is one of the most extreme dimensions, but where politics in Italy and Germany and elsewhere demonstrates that the crisis is broader than just a typical bit of British eccentricity. This has had the effect of freezing the effectiveness of the UN in many ways. It has been one of the worst periods of the UN Security Council that I have seen in years in terms of its ability to agree on approaches to different conflicts. So while we have a great UN leader in Antonio Guterres and in the team around him, these are people hamstrung by the geopolitical environment in which they must operate. Always, at times like this, when the big powers are locking horns, it is to the middle powers that the UN turns. The Swedens and many others in previous times have been critical bulwarks of UN effectiveness when the P5 were distracted by their own conflicts. My prediction is that in this difficult period for the UN, it will be a new coalition of countries, not so heavily European as in the past, but global, countries such as Bangladesh, which will recognize their shared interest in ensuring not just the survival of the UN and its rule of law and values-based systems, but the rebooting of the UN to make sure that as its clients, you are getting effective services from it. So my appeal to you all is not just to look at the UN as somehow a passive, slightly dated partner, the elderly aunt in the family, but to look at the UN as a source of dramatic dynamism if it can be unleashed, and to realize that Bangladesh's time has come. It's for countries like Bangladesh who are in the front line perforce because they are hosts to refugees, because they are contributors to peacekeeping, because they are living out the challenges of modern economic and social development in real time, that it is for countries like Bangladesh to step forward and make the UN work for these different new times we live in. Thank you.
Begin by thanking Inayatullah Khan and Cosmos Foundation for this very interesting and hopefully very productive dialogue. Interesting in the sense it addresses an issue of concern to everyone, but very few people really can grasp what it is, the United Nations, its role and relevance, mostly as you say. Here, apart from Inayatullah Khan, I have to also thank Iftikhar Ahmad Chaudhry, who was my manager, boss, my senior in our offices in Geneva in the 90s. And of course, I have to pay my respects to Lord Brown, who headed UNDP for many years and was a Deputy Secretary General and had a role also in the British politics. I was not aware of that before. I have here our Foreign Secretary, Shahidullah, good colleague of mine, also with us in Geneva, sometimes in the 90s. I have to thank a lot of people here who have been my seniors in public service. Mr. Mukammal Haq, Mr. Inam Ahmad Chaudhry, and I have my two colleagues who worked with me, Sirajul Islam and Shamim, retired ambassadors and foreign secretaries, and of course the distinguished British High Commissioner, Madam. For all of you and others, equally important people, for all of you, my deep respects. Mia, who is heading our UN system here, for you and others, my deep respects. I feel highly honored that Dr. Iftikhar thought me fit to be with you this morning and speak on a matter of which I have very little direct experience, what to talk of studies and research. But of course, as a global citizen, I hope I am now, I do have some ideas about this big organization, the United Nations. And what I say here is I must also admit that I don't speak as a minister, as a citizen, as an informed citizen, I hope, as a conscious global citizen. So my 2 minutes, 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 2 my remarks here are absolutely non-governmental, ungovernmental, non-official, it's personal. The United Nations, it grew with me. Almost that we are contemporaneous in that sense. I was born when the UN was born. Now we are together here today. UN had a very patchy start, the bitterness of League of Nations, and then it came into being after the Second World War, if I'm correct, and provided, to my knowledge, the first global platform for the entire humanity, and has provided a vent through which various tensions, various ideas, bitterness, animosities could really be sort of pushed through, brought up into the Security Council, which is the central body, I think, of this UN organization. And although it failed on occasions, but by and large, overall, the score is positive in my opinion. Particularly, I would like to mention here the post-colonial role of the UN in the early 50s and through 60s in seeing the very large number of countries getting out of the colonial period. They were allowed a place in the global community through the UN. And many of these countries, particularly through the Trusteeship Council, some of these countries could negotiate with their colonial rulers and manage or achieve a decent exit from the colonial days. So that was a great achievement, I think, of the UN system initially. At the same time, the UN also addressed many issues of development, which increasingly became more and more important as times went on. Some of the very important organizations like the FAO, the World Health Organization, the ILO, were born in the initial days. UNESCO contributed tremendously towards building a global human understanding and provided platforms for getting together and sorting out issues, speaking, and clearing out much of the misgivings or much of misinformation that existed on many issues at that time. UNHCR did a tremendous job because of conflicts. Millions of people were uprooted, and UNHCR has been, in my opinion, one of the stellar organizations which has done tremendous service to the needy humanities. Although I should also point out that there are cases of abject failure where the UN failed to address the issues of Palestinians, for example. They've been there living away from their country, from their home, for about 6-7 years, how many years? 70, 80 years now. And this is where UN, in my opinion, for whatever reasons for you to really think about, the record is not very present. We have benefited from the UN, particularly following our liberation in 1971. During the liberation, of course, we went to the UN, our case went to the UN, we had become part of the geopolitical Cold War issue. It was delayed, but finally at the end of the day, I think our case, the case of liberation of Bangladesh, was positively addressed by the UN. But we got it through our blood, by our sacrifice. And following our liberation, UNROB, UN-ROB, many might have forgotten now, UN Relief Operations in Bangladesh, did a tremendous service to our returning refugees from India and to the internally displaced people, providing them immediate food relief, medical relief, and in some cases building up small infrastructure so that the communities could be connected again. In fact, even before we were members of UN legally, UN ROB and ROB was here. United Nations Relief Operations in Bangladesh. Then the WFP came, and all of this together in our initial days, the difficult days following our liberation, UN bodies, tremendous help to Bangladesh. So our thanks to them. And as regards relevance, my first answer is yes, it is very relevant to countries like ours, who sometimes fall into miserable situations because of geopolitical reasons. Although I must add here, some of these very venerable organizations like FAO and WHO and ILO and this, I think they need to be revamped now. Mia is here, she is listening with attention. The times have changed. What was FAO in the 50s, during the days of BRSAN, that FAO is no longer relevant to our needs. We need revamped, more advanced FAO, which addresses our present agricultural questions. These are not the old questions of the early 50s. WHO again, ILO particularly, has become a victim of political, political difficulties. And ILO has not been able to deliver what it wanted, what it was meant to. But still they continue. UNHCR continues. World Food Programme continues. They did a good job here in Bangladesh. So from the point of view of Bangladesh, it is highly relevant that they continue. They are good friends. They provide us a platform through which we can reach the world.
Thank you very much, Lord Brown, for your very eloquent presentation, as usual, like your book on the whole issues. And I have read it, so I know how you look at SDGs and other issues. I think he started off with a lot of optimism, and then gradually, after listening to the crowd, became cautiously optimistic. Am I correct in saying that, sir? Because I think what has happened over the years, that yes, there is no alternative to UN, but there are other spaces where you can also discuss, decide on broader global issues. So let me see how we, as Bangladesh, look at it. We have a strong relations, huge support for the UN and its affiliated body, and it goes back to as late as 1974, when our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, after Bangladesh's entry into the UN in the same month, had a speech at the UNGA. And let me read as to what he said in 1974 about UN, and how much confidence and faith that he attached to the UN as a multilateral body. And I quote, "In a world that is marked by strife and human misery, the United Nations remains the focus of man's hope for the future. Despite many difficulties and obstacles placed in its way, the United Nations, during more than a quarter century of its existence, has significantly contributed towards human progress in the political, economic, social, and cultural fields." Unquote. So you see that back in 1974, he had a huge faith, and when, as a country, we just came out of a 9 months long struggle and trying to put our business together. This is how he tried to put UN in the whole affairs. And our Iftikhar sir has already shared, and also our Honorable Minister, as to how Bangladesh was benefited by the UN. Now, sir, I'll take 2-3 minutes. If you want to look at the relationship between UN and Bangladesh, you have to look at Bangladesh first. The character of the state, the chemistry of the people, the emotions, aspirations of the people, as Iftikhar said, had rightly pointed out. Now, Bangladesh, being a relatively small country and a nation in the midst of rather big nations, always attached huge importance to multilateralism. Even when we started off our struggle, in fact, despite the fact it was Kolkata where our first mission was established, but it is UN where we actually marshaled our campaign during the War of Liberation, and there are books written on it. So from then on, we have always attached huge importance to UN within the context of multilateralism, and that continues. I think there could be hiccups here and there, not that we always, as Lord Brown has rightly pointed out, too optimistic. We can always be cautiously optimistic about UN's role, and that's a global reality that no way should be read as our less faith on UN. I think in that sense we have no alternative, as our Honorable Minister has pointed out. Now, over the year, UN has also changed, the way Bangladesh has changed. Bangladesh, from a rather the receiving end, has moved onto a giving end. We have given a lot of things to UN, not only in terms of humble financial contribution, but our political contribution to the norm setting. Currently, I can share with you that UN is into a negotiation where they would like to have a new regime to look at the sea beyond 200 nautical mile. And Bangladesh is one of the major players in that norm setting now. Now that we realize how important it is for us to have a fair governing regime for ocean, we have put a huge importance onto the whole norm setting exercise in the ocean system. Not only that, and Iftikhar Sir is here, Bangladesh has always been instrumental in the peace building exercises, both in the Commission and the others. Not only contributing peace, but also creating a new architecture of peace building and peacekeeping. You'll be very happy to know that we are almost on the verge of establishing and launching a peace building center in addition to our peacekeeping center, BIPSOT, in Dhaka, with the help of Norway and Japan, where we are planning to build the capacity of our people to be able to engage in the peacekeeping, peace building operation beyond military role. So that's how we are looking at it. So Bangladesh has moved into that, both in terms of norm setting exercises and also implementing some of the issues. I'll just give you one example. In the MDG, we were little behind, realizing that how we go about it. But in the SDG front, we have been ahead of others. In fact, we have been identified by UN as pioneer in testing some of the hypotheses that has been put into the SDGs. And I'll not go into that, but and that is why often we are called as a development model. One particular thing that I seek explain sort of a clarification from Lord Malik Brown is, he said Bangladesh is a middle power. Not that we were not thinking about it, but I would like to know. And he used, sir, you used two issues in describing Bangladesh. One is the soft power and one is the middle power. Are you looking at it as a kind of a complementary to each other, or you're trying and giving a different description narrative to Bangladesh? Because this will also help placing Bangladesh into the UN in future. I will just finish with one idea, that there was a time when we had only UN as an international space where states could go and discuss their problem, issues and challenges and priorities. But we see over the years, we have for international justice, ICC, ICJ, which has independently being developed. We have WTO, World Economic Forum, as a space where we can discuss broader economic issues. It is not only UN. We have also INGOs. INGOs has, some of the INGOs are almost as big as UN bodies. So they have a huge space to discuss social issues, especially related to human suffering. Then we have, on the peacekeeping and wartime situation, Red Cross and Red Crescent, which is outside UN and creating more new spaces, and our Red Cross and Red Crescents are taking up issues which they haven't in the past. unlike Second World War or First World War. So UN is under huge competition, both from the international private organizations, from INGOs, and from some of the bodies that is being developed. So if the whole issue of accountability comes in, where we go? For political retreat, we go to UN. But when it comes to really taking on international accountability, we go to ICC and ICJ. So this is how I think the future looks like, and Bangladesh would like to continue to remain active in both areas. But our friendship, and our honorable minister has rightly pointed out, is rock solid.